capital in the way that we behave, it'll just simply prolong the downturn. Now, in the spirit of just simply trying to change the tone, and I will quickly acknowledge that hope is not a strategy, I would just like to put at least one possibility on the table. And it might be not the probability, but it's at least a possibility. And that is, I'm not sure that we fully appreciate the psychological component of economic activity. And when I try to look forward in the spirit of, plan for the worst, expect the worst, but hope for the best, when I try to look forward with that sense of hope, I'm really hoping that the enormous popularity that President Obama brings to office, the hope on which he campaigned, and the goodwill that he's generating will actually be able to influence public sentiment in some positive way. And if we can find a combination of improved public sentiment as the product of a popular, charismatic new leader stepping onto the stage, and then combine that with the unprecedented levels of fiscal stimulus that have been described and committed, and the aggressive approach to coordinated monetary policy, that maybe, just maybe, we might see in the second half of 2009 a beginning to try to turn the tide here. But I will acknowledge that that's as much a hope as it is a prediction. But in the spirit of wanting at least one more tone in the discussion, I put that on the table. Thank you.
Schiff.
Well, basically the problems with the U.S. economy, unfortunately, are going to get a lot worse in the years ahead. The larger problem for the global economy is going to be to the extent that the world continues to loan America's money to finance its never-ending and misguided stream of bailouts and stimulus packages. Our problems are going to continue to adversely affect our creditors around the world. But the broader problem is that so few people, so few economists seem to really understand the problem. And these are the very economists who couldn't see this economic train wreck coming, even though it should have been painfully obvious years ago. But most look at this economic downturn, this recession, and say this is the problem. This is not the problem. This is the solution to the problem. The problem is the phony economic boom that preceded this bust and which made it inevitable. You see, for years, Americans have lived and continue to live in a phony bubble economy. What we do is we borrow money from people all around the world, and we spend it mainly on products that we import from hardworking people around the world. And as we were borrowing and spending and basically dissipating the world's wealth, we blew up this phony bubble economy that was geared around consumer spending, and we built up this phony sugar sector economy that could only exist so long as the world was willing to fund it. But ultimately, this bubble burst. Like all bubbles or Ponzi scheme, our economy functions under the same principles that Bernie Madoff used to run his investment fund. And ultimately, all these things fail. And so what's happening now, the free market is finally trying to cure the economy of this disease that misguided government policies affected us with. You see, the real engine of economic growth is underconsumption. Because when you don't consume, you save. And when you have savings, you can finance capital investments. And it's capital investments that leads to legitimate economic growth, that leads to enhanced productivity and rising standard of living. We didn't have any of that. In the United States, as we were borrowing and spending all this money, we confused reckless consumption with legitimate economic growth because our GDP became increasingly comprised of consumption, consumer spending, and we counted that as real growth. And then we looked at rising stock prices and real estate prices, which were bubbles, and we confused that with legitimate wealth creation, but there was no real wealth there. And so now the market is trying to purge itself of those imbalances. Unfortunately, the government is interfering with that process. The government only knows one way to put out a fire, and that's pour gasoline on it. And the more gasoline they pour, the bigger the fire gets. They have to understand that we're in trouble as a nation because we spent and borrowed too much money. And the solution is to reverse those policies. From the government, which needs to shrink and spend less, to consumers that need to spend less money and save more money. But unfortunately, this is not going to happen. The government is preventing this from happening. And one of the biggest, I think, consequences of this fiasco is that the free market is getting blamed for problems that were created by government. Ex-President, former President Bush, in his speech, I remember he said that Wall Street got drunk. And he was right, Wall Street did get drunk, and so did Main Street. Our whole country was drunk. But what President Bush didn't point out is where they all get the alcohol. They got the alcohol from the Fed, from Alan Greenspan. He's the one who irresponsibly lowered interest rates down to nothing and left them there for several years and then raised them very slowly. And because of all this cheap money, Wall Street speculated with it. Americans speculated and spent it. They remodeled and bought homes, and they bought imported products and cars and gadgets and all sorts of things. But none of this would have happened. We wouldn't have had a subprime market. We wouldn't have had teaser rates and option arms. None of these things would have come into existence were it not for the Federal Reserve. Of course, the biggest problem in the housing market was Fannie and Freddie, which were government-created entities that created a gigantic moral hazard by allowing American citizens to borrow money from the U.S. government as a co-signer. This is what initially enabled Americans to overpay for houses that they couldn't afford, and which enabled or allowed creditors to lend them money without any regard to the consequences. You see, normally in a free market economy, we don't have to worry about greed because there's a counterbalance to fear. But when government intervention interferes with normal free market mechanisms, they can short-circuit that, and it leads to this reckless behavior. And unfortunately, what's happening now is the politicians are using this crisis as an excuse to grow the government at precisely the point where they should be shrinking it. And what's going to happen is we run the risks of repeating all the mistakes of the 1930s and recreating another Great Depression, except this time around it's going to be an inflationary depression. And it's a big revisionist history. A lot of people think that the Depression was the result of the fact that Herbert Hoover didn't do anything. He let the free market work, and then Roosevelt came along and saved us with a bunch of socialism. That's not what happened. What happened is Hoover did exactly what Bush did. Hoover refused to let the market function. Hoover bailed out everybody he could. Hoover interfered in the free market, trying to reset prices and wages. And when Hoover's actions turned that economic downturn into the beginning of the Great Depression, and Roosevelt came in, he further impeded the free market, created the Depression, and prevented market forces from ending that downturn far sooner than otherwise would have been the case. Now, the question that you had up on the board earlier about how long this downturn was going to last, I wish they had broken it into two parts. How long is the U.S. economic downturn going to last, and how long is the global downturn going to last? In America, the answer is probably at least another 5 or 10 years, maybe more, depending on how much damage the incoming Obama administration does, how much more of our economy becomes centrally government planned, where Washington tries to allocate resources instead of the free market. They keep bailing out companies that they should let fail, and they keep encouraging consumers to spend when they already broke from spending too much. Depending on how much damage they do, who knows when we're going to be out of this mess. But the rest of the world has a big choice with it. The rest of the world doesn't have to continue to accumulate U.S. dollars and U.S. government debt that will never be repaid. And in fact, even as an American, I can say that the sooner the world stops enabling this profligacy, the sooner the American economy can rebuild. But we need to allow this phony economy to collapse if we're ever going to rebuild the viable economy. But for the global economy, for the rest of the nation, particularly people in countries like Saudi Arabia, they have to understand that their future is not as subsidized in America's past or America's consumption. The rest of the world needs to reclaim their resources, their productivity for themselves. They don't need to beg or finance the United States. What the world needs to understand is if Americans stop consuming, the economic train isn't going to fall off the tracks. We're the caboose, we're not the engine. The real secret to the global economy is the savings and production that are taking place outside the United States. And if the world simply allows the dollar to fall, sure, there's going to be some initial losses on bad money loaned to the United States, but you don't continue to throw good money after the bad. What you need to do is allow your own currencies to appreciate so that your own citizens can enjoy the fruits of their labor, can enjoy the higher standard of living that appreciating currencies will bring, and force some discipline on the United States and on American politicians and our central bankers. Because we're going to spend all the money you're foolish enough to lend us. But if we stop lending, we're going to be forced to do the right thing. And ultimately, the choice America is going to have to make is going to be one of legitimate sacrifice or hyperinflation. And I'm afraid, based on everything that I see, I think there's a good chance that the next crisis that the U.S. government is setting up is much bigger than the one that they did in 2002, 2003, when they blew up the housing bubble. They blew up a gigantic bubble in the Treasury market, and I think the tremendous amount of money that they're likely to print to fund this New Deal is likely to lead to a complete collapse of the U.S. dollar and a run on our currency. And unfortunately, that's probably one of the most painful economic experiences any nation can endure. And I'm hoping that Americans see the error of their ways and we can reverse course before it's too late. Thank you.